Hello. Today, we'll trace the path of a concept we probably feel more than we think about. Silence. Is silence really an absence? Or is it a kind of presence that can be heard in its own way? From ancient philosophy to modern science, from art to everyday life, silence has been a persistent mystery occupying the human mind and perception. Sometimes the source of peace, sometimes the echo of fear. Silence is in fact a far more complex phenomenon than we assume. An undefined feeling. What is silence? At first glance, silence seems like nothing more than the absence of sound. Yet, this definition does not fully capture either its physical reality or the human experience. Silence is not simply what we do not hear. More often, it is the presence of what is difficult to hear. From a physical perspective, we speak of silence in environments where sound waves are measurably reduced. Levels approaching 0 decibels and below are technically close to absolute silence. In practice, however, absolute silence is rarely achieved. Even in the quietest environments, humans begin to hear sounds from within their own bodies, the beating of the heart, the flow in the vessels, the movement of muscles. In silence, the only thing that continues to produce sound is the human being himself. At this point, psychology steps in. The brain is a mechanism that constantly generates meaning. When this system encounters a void in a completely silent environment, it can trigger hallucinatory sounds, ringing, or intensified inner monologue. That is why silence is, for many people, not primarily relaxing, but at times disturbing. A person exposed to silence is forced to confront his or her inner voices. On a philosophical level, silence is considered in many Eastern traditions not as a lack of meaning, but as something that lies beyond meaning. In Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Indian metaphysics, silence is a form of wisdom at the limits of knowledge. In Western thought, silence has often been associated with absence, deficiency, or lack of communication. Yet in aesthetic and literary traditions, silence has also been used as a mode of expression. The gap created by silence leaves space for the reader or viewer to think and feel. In social relations, silence can turn into a meaningful language of its own. An unanswered question, a pause that heightens tension, or eye contact amid a crowd. All of these are acts of silence and part of communication. Silence sometimes expresses oppression, sometimes acceptance, sometimes resistance. In short, silence is not merely an acoustic void. It is also a neurological, psychological, philosophical, and cultural experience. It continues to exert its influence even where it cannot be measured. Silence is one of the simplest yet most intense ways in which a human being comes into contact, both with the outside world and with his or her own inner world. Absolute silence. Is it possible, or is it an impossibility? In everyday life, silence is often named as a goal or a need. Scientifically speaking, however, the phrase absolute silence is highly controversial. Physically, sound is vibration propagating through a medium, usually air or sometimes solid and liquid matter. When these waves are eliminated, we speak of silence. But is there truly a space where these waves drop to zero and no sound exists? Theoretically, yes. In practice, such environments are only approached in specially designed anechoic chambers. These structures absorb sound waves almost entirely, eliminating echo. Yet even here, complete silence cannot truly be achieved. In experiments conducted inside these rooms, people begin to hear the sounds of their own bodies within minutes. Their heartbeat, their breathing, even the sounds of their digestive systems. When external sounds disappear, internal bodily sounds become more pronounced. In other words, when a person settles into silence, they begin to hear their own noise. Absolute silence is also a matter of medium. Outer space is often imagined as a place devoid of sound. Indeed, in space, there is no medium such as air or water through which sound waves can propagate. But this is only valid in terms of mechanical wave transmission. In space, radio waves, gamma rays, and particles are constantly in motion. In other words, the flow of energy continues. So even this void is, physically speaking, an active environment. From a neurological standpoint, the experience of absolute silence is also impossible. The human brain is a system that constantly seeks stimuli and produces interpretations. Even in states of sleep, meditation, or trance, the mind does not fully shut down. The so-called default mode network in the brain remains active when a person is detached from external stimuli. This shows that even within silence, internal activity continues. In conclusion, absolute silence is a phenomenon that can be defined technically, but does not fully exist in human experience. Silence may be a desired state, but no matter how much it is achieved, the biological and mental structure of the human being is complex enough to disturb that silence. In a sense, true silence exists only as an ideal, an unattainable boundary in both the physical and mental realm. Silence and the mind. How the brain responds to quiet silence is not just a property of the external world. It is also a lack of external stimuli that directly affects how the mind works. The human brain constantly receives information from the environment and processes it to create meaning. But when these external stimuli suddenly disappear in a silent environment, the brain turns toward its own internal voices and functions. This creates distinctive effects at both neurological and psychological levels. Research shows that silence has two principal effects on the human mind: heightened awareness and a strengthened inner dialogue. As external sounds diminish, the individual begins to perceive their own thoughts, emotions, and memories more clearly. On the one hand, this can support mental clarity and creative thinking. On the other, it can cause anxiety, regret, or repressed feelings to surface. In this sense, silence can be both therapeutic and triggering. On the neuroscientific level, notable findings have been made. In silent environments, increased activity has been observed in the brain's hippocampus and amygdala. The hippocampus is associated with memory and learning. The amygdala is the center of emotional responses. For this reason, silence does not slow down mental processing so much as intensify certain cognitive functions. Creative problem-solving and emotional regulation in particular can work more effectively in quiet settings. Equally striking is silence's effect on the brain's default mode network, which becomes active when the mind is not focused on the external world. In silence, the activity of this network increases, leading to deeper self-reflection and a stronger contact with one's inner self. Yet prolonged exposure to silence is not positive for everyone. Particularly for those who are accustomed to very noisy environments, silence may initially provoke unease rather than peace. When the mind encounters emptiness, it often fills it with past experiences, worries, or imagined scenarios. This means that silence is not always a comforting experience. In short, the relationship between silence and the mind is multi-layered. The brain does not merely respond passively to silence. Silence changes the direction of mental activity. At times, it opens a healing space of insight. At others, it can bring mental turbulence to the surface. Thus, for the human mind, silence can be both a place of rest and a kind of examination. Silence and psychology. The emotional face of stillness. Silence is not just an environmental condition. It is also an experience that echoes in the depths of human psychology. For some, stillness means peace and tranquility. For others, it opens the door to an unsettling inner confrontation. This contradiction makes the impact of silence on individual psychology complex and multidimensional. Psychologically, silence is often synonymous with turning inward. Stepping away from noise causes a person to shift attention from the outside world to their own thoughts and feelings. This can increase processes of self-awareness. In silence, a person comes into closer contact with themselves. Thoughts become clearer. Past experiences resurface. Repressed emotions emerge. In therapeutic settings, this inward focus is often used as an important tool for gaining insight. But this process is not always easy or positive. For some individuals, silence intensifies feelings of loneliness. In the absence of external stimuli, mental hum, worrying thoughts, or negative self-talk can take over. In conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, silence can become a trigger. Thus, the psychological effect of silence varies depending on a person's mental structure and life history. Conversely, when consciously chosen, silence can become a healing power. Meditation, mindfulness, and some forms of psychotherapy use silence to create mental space. Through such practices, a person learns to direct attention to the present moment and to observe their thoughts rather than be swept away by them. This strengthens emotional regulation skills. In this sense, silence becomes a tool that allows a person to notice and transform their mental noise. Cultural differences also shape the psychological perception of silence. In many Western cultures, silence is often seen as uncomfortable or equated with lack of communication. In many Eastern cultures, it is associated with wisdom, inner balance, and respect. These differences show that our emotional reactions to silence are, in part, socially conditioned. In conclusion, silence is not a psychological vacuum. On the contrary, it is a mental ground that makes underlying fullness noticeable. In silence, a person is left alone with their inner universe. How bright or dark this universe feels depends greatly on the individual's inner resources, life experiences, and psychological balance. The physiology of silence, bodily responses, and health effects. Silence does not only affect mental processes, it is also a powerful environmental factor that directly impacts bodily functioning. In the modern world, noise is one of the most common sources of stress. Silence, by contrast, enters as a balancing factor against this state of constant stimulation and has the potential to reset the body's physiological systems. Studies show that in quiet environments, the human body secretes lower levels of cortisol, the primary stress hormone that drives the fight or flight response. In noisy surroundings, cortisol levels rise, heart rate speeds up, and muscles tense. Silence breaks this cycle. The autonomic nervous system shifts into parasympathetic mode, the rest and digest phase. Heartbeat slows, muscles relax, digestion improves. Silence also exerts constructive effects on the brain. In a 2013 study, as little as 2 minutes of silence was observed to increase the production of hippocampal neurons associated with brain cell growth. This suggests that silence is linked not only to stress reduction, but also to brain health and neuroplasticity. Positive effects have been noted particularly in learning, memory, and attention. Sleep quality, too, is directly affected by silence. People sleeping in noisy conditions show more microarousals during the night, whereas, in a quiet environment, sleep becomes deeper and less fragmented. Deep sleep is critical for the immune system, hormonal balance, Anechoic, and cellular repair processes. Thus, silence supports biological renewal both during the day and at night. Silence also helps regulate blood pressure and breathing rhythm. Many rehabilitation programs recommend silent walks, retreats in nature, and quiet exercise sessions to reduce physiological stress. These practices aim to establish a holistic balance in both physical and mental health. In short, silence enables the body to rebalance its physiological rhythm. It has the potential to repair the wear and tear that modern life's constant overstimulation imposes on the nervous system. For this reason, silence should be viewed not only as a psychological need, but also as a biological necessity. Silence in music. The balance between the notes. Silence is not the opposite of music. It is one of its most meaningful building blocks. What makes a melody memorable is not only the sounds but also the pauses between them. Rests create tension in the listener's mind, draw attention, and are among the most effective means of adding emotional depth. For this reason, composers use silence skillfully, turning the spaces between notes into tools of expression. 20th-century experimental music pushed this idea to the extreme. American composer John Cage's piece, 433, consists of a pianist sitting at the instrument without playing any notes for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Yet this work is not filled with nothing. The audience is coughing, the creaking of seats, the hum of the hall. In short, every accidental sound in the environment becomes part of the music. In this way, Cage declares that silence in music is actually a sensory window that heightens awareness. In classical music, silence has long been used to create dramatic effect. In Beethoven's symphonies, sudden pauses increase musical tension. In Bach's works, measured rests form part of a mathematical order. Even in modern pop music, brief, sudden silences can make a track more impactful and memorable. Silence in music is a test not just for the listener, but also for the performer. In those moments, not only the unplayed notes, but also the performer's mental state and command of the piece come to the fore. Silence, therefore, demands both technical and emotional mastery. In short, silence in music is not an absence, but a deliberate choice, a subtle element of expression. Notes speak, but sometimes silence says something even deeper. Social silence, silenced voices, and freedom of expression. Silence is not always a sign of peace. Sometimes it signals suppression. In societies, silence can be the visible surface of situations where the voices of individuals or groups are not heard, are silenced, or are too fearful to speak. In this context, silence can appear both as a tool of oppression and as a form of protest. Throughout history, in authoritarian regimes, silence has often been the result of censorship. The muzzling of the press, restrictions on individual freedom of expression, and cultures where those who speak up get into trouble all normalize silence. The most insidious form of this is self-censorship. A person no longer needs external pressure. Internalized fears are enough to quiet them. Such silences corrode not only individuals, but also the entire structure of social communication. Yet silence can also be a form of resistance. Silent marches, wordless protests, or simply the refusal to speak can become a rebellion against the system's imposed forms of communication. These silences can be the loudest of screams. From Gandhi's methods of passive resistance to today's silent sit-ins, many social movements have harnessed the power of silence. For some minority groups and individuals who have experienced trauma, silence carries the trace of suppressed histories. Understanding such silences is vital for building empathy and creating spaces where expression is possible. Social silence is not only the responsibility of individuals, but also of institutions. Hearing silenced voices, giving them room, and questioning the meanings hidden behind silence are prerequisites for a freer and more just society. Silence in nature. Is there ever truly no sound? When we think of silence, the first places that come to mind are usually natural settings. a mountain peak, the depths of a forest, a snow-covered plain, or a quiet lakeside. But the reality behind these images is far more complex than it appears. In nature, absolute silence is almost non-existent. Most of the time, what we call silence is simply hidden in frequencies we do not hear or are not used to. At night, birds may fall quiet, but nocturnal creatures take their place. The calls of owls, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of animals moving through leaves. Even at moments when we feel a forest is completely silent, hundreds of micro sounds play in the background like a symphony. In nature, silence is largely the absence of human noise, the stopping of artificial sounds such as engines, traffic, and speech, and the emergence of natural frequencies. Even in isolated environments like caves or glaciers, silence is not absolute. Cave researchers report hearing the echoes of dripping water, the expansion of rocks, or the hum of underground air currents. Similarly, travelers who encounter silence in polar regions eventually realize that these landscapes are actually filled with faint cracking sounds and distant vibrations of the wind. In nature, silence is not so much a physical state as a gap in our perception. To ears trained by urban noise, the low-frequency, subtle sounds of nature are often perceived as quiet. Yet these environments pulse with nature's own rhythm. Our bodies relax more easily in such settings. Heart rate slows. Brain waves shift. This helps explain why natural silence feels calming and restorative. In short, silence in nature is not emptiness but a dance of presences, vibrations, and rhythms waiting to be noticed. The real question is, are we truly listening? Silence and technology, a void lost in noise. Since the Industrial Revolution, humanity has grown accustomed to the noise that comes hand in hand with technological progress. From the rhythmic clatter of steam engines to the roar of car engines, from the constant hum of cities to digital devices overflowing with notifications, silence has become almost a luxury in the modern age. Noise is now not just sound. It is also the invisible cause of many problems, such as distraction, stress, sleep disturbances, and mental fatigue. Technology has mostly amplified this problem rather than solved it. Yet in some areas, silence has begun to be consciously rediscovered. Noise-canceling headphones, silent modes, digital detox apps, acoustic architectural solutions, and sound-insulated spaces have emerged as tangible responses to the human need for protection from noise. Paradoxically, however, each solution creates a new dependence on technology. In the midst of modern life, silence has become a kind of counterculture. Quiet phones, silent libraries, silent yoga, and silence-based retreats are attempts to reclaim our scattered attention in a digital age. Silence is no longer just the absence of sound. It has become a stance against technology, a zone of freedom, even a form of resistance. Silence is often equated with peace, yet human nature has not evolved to withstand total, soundless isolation. Anechoic chambers, the echo-free rooms where all acoustic ties to the outer world are cut, push the limits of silence. These rooms are designed for sound engineering and scientific experiments. Their walls, floors, and ceilings are covered with cone-shaped sound-absorbing foam. Sound is reflected repeatedly on these surfaces until it is completely absorbed. In these isolated spaces, there is no echo. Your whisper does not bounce back from the wall. Your footsteps disappear. And what remains are only the sounds inside your own body. Spending a few minutes in such a room is far from ordinary. You begin to hear your own breathing, your heartbeat, the sounds of your digestion. When the brain finds no external stimuli, it turns inward. Physical as well as psychological boundaries are pushed. Some people report dizziness, loss of balance, anxiety within just a few minutes. In absolute silence, the brain loses its bearings, because orientation depends in part on the presence of environmental sound. These experiences show that silence is not an empty void, but a matter of balance. Too much silence can be as stressful as too much noise. The human mind and body function by oscillating between a dose of sound and a dose of quiet. Absolute silence can be an interesting experiment, but it is not a sustainable state. To explore the limits of silence is, in a sense, to define the limits of confronting oneself. These rooms remind us how thunderously loud our inner world can become when all external sounds fall quiet. The sound of the future, the evolution and meaning of silence. In the past, silence was both a luxury and an ordinary state of nature. Before electricity, nights were quiet and cities were calm. Since the Industrial Revolution, however, humanity has become surrounded by ever-increasing noise. Today, in major cities, silence has almost become a historical memory. This transformation has changed the meaning of silence itself. In the modern era, silence is no longer simply the mark of absence. It is something we actively seek. Escaping noise, stepping away from technology, engaging in digital detox, all these reflect this need. People turn to silent retreat camps, meditative stays, and rooms where electronic devices are switched off. Silence has become a sanctuary, a form of mental renewal. This shift is also connected to technological transformation. In the age of artificial intelligence, talking assistants, constant notifications, and smart devices have become part of daily life. In response, silence emerges as the antidote to digital noise. Deliberately designed quiet products, silent blenders, silent cars, quiet keyboards, are commercial reflections of this trend. At the same time, silence is being rediscovered in art and design. The absence of sound has become a compositional tool. Silence is no longer a gap, but a layer that creates meaning. As in John Cage's 433's, silence is not merely heard, it is experienced. How, then, will we define silence in the future? As space tourism, deep-sea research, and environments utterly unfamiliar to human perception become part of our experience, will our sense of silence change? As digital environments produce ever more noise, will mental silence become the greatest need of future generations? Silence is an invisible but powerful building block. Without it, sound has no meaning, just as matter cannot be understood without space. The future may depend not only on creating more sound, but on designing better silence as well. Silence. At first glance, it seems like an absence. Yet it is one of the deepest presences in our lives. Sometimes the source of peace, sometimes a mirror for inner confrontation, sometimes a symbol of social resistance. The most meaningful moments in music are created by silence. Our minds hear their own voices in silence. Our bodies heal in silence. We have seen that silence is not heard only with the ear. It is felt with the heart, the mind, and culture. Perhaps that is why silence is neither a fully attainable goal nor a completely vanishing void. Silence is the invisible rhythm of our existence. And perhaps the real question is this: when we say we are searching for silence, are we truly trying to escape it, or are we actually trying to find ourselves within it?